Thomas Hartman had always been a man of quiet ambition, a quality that had earned him both admiration and envy in his workplace. He had climbed the ranks at Barnett Industries through sheer dedication and an uncanny ability to close the most difficult deals. In the sales department, where sharks thrived and everyone had their knives out, he had emerged as a star. But not everyone celebrated his success, especially not Mr. Seymour, the regional manager. Seymour was a tall man with thinning gray hair and a temper that could unsettle even the most composed employees. To many, he was an enigma, an authoritative figure who often crossed the line into cruelty. His eyes seemed to fixate on Thomas with more disdain as the months went by, and it was hard to pinpoint when the hostility had started. Perhaps it was when Thomas closed that landmark deal with Convertech, netting the company millions and stealing the spotlight from Seymour. So, when Seymour casually invited Thomas out for drinks after work one Friday evening, it didn't sit right with him. The invite came after Thomas had just sealed another major deal, this time with Sterling Telecommunications, a particularly difficult client that had been on the company's radar for months. Seymour, with his thin-lipped smile, clapped Thomas on the back in front of everyone in the office. "You've outdone yourself this time, Hartman. We should celebrate. There's a place I know not far from here, what do you say?" The tension in the air was palpable, and Thomas could see the curious glances exchanged among his coworkers. Normally, Seymour wouldn't bother extending any pleasantries his way, much less an invitation to drinks. Something about the offer felt loaded, like a chess move designed to corner him. Still, declining wasn't an option. It would raise too many questions, and Thomas wasn't in the business of making enemies out of his superiors. Not yet. "Sure, Mr. Seymour," Thomas replied, maintaining his practiced smile. "Sounds like a plan." But as they walked out of the office that evening, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. The bar Seymour led him to was the kind of place where shadows clung to the walls and the scent of stale cigarettes hung in the air. It wasn't the upscale establishment Thomas had expected, given the company Seymour usually kept. Instead, it was an old, dimly lit dive nestled in an alley, the neon sign outside flickering in and out. Inside, the patrons were sparse, mostly rough-looking men nursing drinks alone, their faces obscured by the dim light. A faint jukebox played something bluesy in the background, and the bar stools creaked with every slight movement. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. There was something off about this place, but it was too late to back out now. Seymour ordered them both whiskey, offering no pleasantries, just silence. They sat at the bar, side by side, not speaking for several long minutes, sipping their drink. Thomas stared at the amber liquid in his glass, his mind racing. Why had Seymour brought him here? And was this some kind of twisted test, or worse, a setup? "You've been doing well for yourself, Hartman," Seymour finally said, breaking the silence. His tone was deceptively casual, but there was an edge to it that made Thomas's skin crawl. Maybe a little too well. Thomas looked up, narrowing his eyes slightly. "I'm just doing my job." Seymour chuckled, a cold sound that barely masked the resentment bubbling beneath the surface. "Oh, I know you are, but some people, they don't know when to stay in their lane." Before Thomas could respond, two men sidled up to the bar on the other side of him. He hadn't noticed them before, but now they were close, too close. One was tall and burly, with a scar running down the side of his face, the other shorter but stockier with a menacing grin. They eyed Thomas like predators sizing up their prey. "What are you looking at?" the shorter one snarled, his voice low and threatening. Thomas blinked, taken aback. "I wasn't looking at anything," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "The situation was escalating and fast." "Sure looked like you were glaring at us," the taller man added, cracking his knuckles. The bar suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. Seymour leaned back in his seat, sipping his drink with an air of detachment, as if watching an entertaining scene unfold. Thomas glanced at him, searching for some kind of clue, but Seymour's expression was unreadable. "So I don't want any trouble," Thomas said, turning back to the men. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Just having a drink with my boss." The shorter man laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Your boss, huh? Well, your boss ain't gonna save you." Before Thomas could react, the tall man grabbed him by the collar and yanked him off the bar stool. The world spun for a moment as he was slammed against the wall, the man's breath hot against his face. Pain exploded across Thomas's cheek as the shorter man's fist connected with his face. The bar seemed to grow quieter, as if the few patrons were too used to this kind of violence to intervene. Thomas struggled, his vision blurring, but the two men were too strong, and the punches came in rapid succession. Through the haze of pain, Thomas heard Seymour's voice. "You know, Hartman, I've never liked you," Seymour said, his voice cold, almost amused. "You walk around the office like you own the place, like your success entitles you to something. But you don't belong, not really." Thomas's head pounded as he tried to make sense of Seymour's words. This was personal. It wasn't just about work, it was about control, power, and Seymour's ego. As the two men continued their assault, Seymour watched with a twisted smile on his face. It was clear now this wasn't a random bar fight. Seymour had orchestrated this. "You're pathetic," Seymour sneered, raising his glass to his lips. "I hired these guys to teach you a lesson. Figured a little humility would do you some good." Thomas gritted his teeth, rage bubbling beneath the surface. He had been blindsided, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. He lashed out, his elbow connecting with the taller man's ribs, forcing him to loosen his grip. But before Thomas could take another swing, the door to the bar swung open with a bang. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding instant attention. The low hum of conversation ceased, and even the jukebox seemed to falter. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an air of authority that made the room feel even smaller. His eyes swept across the scene, landing first on Thomas, battered and bloodied, then on Seymour and the two men. The gangsters froze at the sight of him. Thomas, struggling to catch his breath, could feel the change in the air, the sudden tension thickening like a storm about to break. "Bobby," the shorter man stammered, his bravado crumbling in an instant. "We didn't know." "I don't care what you didn't know," Bobby growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You laid hands on my son." Thomas blinked, trying to process the words through the fog of pain. "Son? What was this man talking about?" Seymour looked equally stunned, his cruel smirk disappearing as Bobby turned his attention toward him. "You," Bobby said, his voice like steel. "You've got about 2 seconds to explain yourself before I decide whether I should end this here and now." Seymour paled, his drink slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and he knew it. Thomas, still dazed, stared up at the man. "Bobby, his father?" The pieces began to fall into place, and with them came a flood of memories he had long buried. His mother, Vicky, had always been evasive when it came to talking about his father. Thomas had grown up believing the man had left them without a word, but now standing in front of him was a man who seemed very much involved in the underworld and very much invested in protecting his son. Bobby took a step towards Seymour, his fists clenched, but it was the two gangsters who caught his immediate wrath. "You idiots," Bobby snarled. "Do you even know who you're messing with?" His voice was like thunder shaking the air in the bar. Dirk and Ken shrank back, exchanging nervous glances as they realized just how badly they had miscalculated. "Bobby," Dirk began, but Bobby silenced him with a sharp look. "Phew, what? You thought you'd beat on some innocent guy for kicks? Or did Seymour here promise you a payday?" Bobby's voice was lethal now, and he turned to Thomas, who was still reeling from the revelation. "You all right, son?" Thomas, still trying to process the whirlwind of information, managed a nod, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. The word son felt foreign on Bobby's lips, but there was no mistaking the protective fire in his eyes. Seymour, pale and visibly shaken, took a step back, trying to blend into the shadows. But Bobby's gaze snapped to him like a hawk spotting prey. "And you," Bobby growled, "you think you can mess with my family and walk away?" Thomas's mind raced as he watched the scene unfold. This man, his father, had power. The kind of power that made men tremble. The kind of power that clearly terrified Seymour and his hired thugs. It was a far cry from the life Thomas had built for himself, a life free from the shadows of crime and danger. But here he was, face to face with the past he never knew he had. The bar owner, a middle-aged woman named Nita, stepped out from behind the counter. Her expression softened as she looked at Thomas, then turned to Bobby. "So Bobby," she said softly, "let's not do this here. You don't need to make things worse for the boy." Bobby's eyes softened when they met Nita's, and for a moment, the hard, ruthless exterior cracked. Thomas noticed the look they exchanged, filled with unspoken history. "Nita's right," Bobby finally said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned to Seymour and the two thugs. "Get out, now." Seymour stumbled, his bravado completely shattered. He scrambled for the door, Dirk and Ken close behind, their tails firmly tucked between their legs. As the door swung shut behind them, the bar fell silent once again. Thomas sat in stunned silence as Bobby took the stool next to him. The intensity of the moment had subsided, but the weight of the truth pressed down on him. This man was his father, the father he had never known. "I suppose you have questions," Bobby said, not looking at him, but at the half-empty whiskey glass on the bar. Thomas nodded slowly. His mind swirled with memories of his childhood, his mother, Vicky, her struggles, her determination to raise him on her own. All those times he'd asked about his father and received only vague, distant answers. Now he understood why. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice raspy from the tension. "Why now? Why show up like this after all these years?" Bobby sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of a lifetime of regrets. He finally met Thomas's eyes, and the depth of sadness in them caught Thomas off guard. "I didn't think you'd ever need me. Your mother, she made it clear that she didn't want you anywhere near my world. I thought I was doing you a favor by staying away." Thomas clenched his fists, anger and confusion churning inside him. "A favor? You think leaving me and Mom behind was some kind of noble act? She struggled, we struggled, and now you just show up out of nowhere, acting like you can fix everything." Bobby's jaw tightened, and for a moment the hardened gangster facade he turned. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't lived with the guilt every damn day?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the raw emotion beneath the surface. "Your mother left because she knew who I was becoming. I couldn't blame her for that. But believe me, son, I never wanted you to live in my shadow." The air between them was thick with unsaid things. Thomas struggled to reconcile the image of this man, his father, with the one his mother had indirectly painted over the years. But Nita, the bar owner, was watching the conversation unfold with a knowing look, as though she had witnessed this tension long before it reached this boiling point. "Your mother loved you, Thomas," Nita said gently, stepping forward. "She loved Bobby too, in her own way, but she couldn't live with the choices he made." Thomas turned to her, surprised by her familiarity with his past. "How do you know all this?" Nita smiled sadly. "I knew your mother well. Vicky was like a sister to me. We grew up in this neighborhood, back when things weren't so complicated." She glanced at Bobby, the unspoken history between them clearer now. When Bobby started getting mixed up with the wrong people, Vicky tried to make it work. But the deeper he got into that life, the more she knew she had to leave, for your sake. Bobby shook his head, his expression pained. "She tried to save me, Thomas. But by the time I realized what I was losing, it was too late. I couldn't walk away from the life. It had already swallowed me whole." Thomas looked down at his hands, torn between anger and empathy. The man in front of him wasn't the faceless figure he had imagined growing up. He was human, flawed, and filled with the same regret and pain that Thomas had carried for years. But that didn't change the fact that his absence had left a void that neither time nor apologies could easily fill. "And what now?" Thomas asked quietly. "You think we can just pick up where you left off?" Bobby shook his head. "No, I don't. I don't expect forgiveness, and I sure as hell don't expect things to go back to normal. But I'm here now, and I want to try. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Thomas didn't respond right away, his emotions too tangled to sort out in that moment. But before he could even begin to process it all, Nita spoke up again. "There's more you should know," she said, her voice soft but serious. "About your mother, about why she left. It wasn't just Bobby's criminal life that drove her away." Thomas looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Nita glanced at Bobby, as if seeking permission to continue. He gave her a small nod, and she turned back to Thomas. "Vicky didn't just leave because of the danger Bobby was in," Nita explained. "She left because she found out something she never told you." Thomas's pulse quickened. His mother had always been a private person, but she had never given him any reason to believe there was more to her story. "What are you talking about?" Bobby took a deep breath, clearly struggling with the weight of what was about to be revealed. "Your mother, she was pregnant again when she left. You have a sister, Thomas." The room seemed to tilt, and Thomas gripped the edge of the bar to steady himself. "Sister." His voice barely came out as a whisper. The shock hit him like a punch to the gut. "Where is she? What happened to her?" Nita's face softened with sympathy. "Your mother lost the baby a few months after she left. It was one of the reasons she never tried to come back. She didn't want you to carry the burden of her pain." Thomas felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. All these years he had believed his mother's decision to leave had been solely about protecting him from his father's criminal world. Now he was faced with the truth that she had been carrying far more pain than he had ever realized. "I never knew," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Bobby placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture awkward but sincere. "Neither did I. She never told me about the baby, not until it was too late." The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things left unsaid over the years. Thomas's mind raced with memories of his mother, her quiet strength, her sadness, the way she had always looked at him with a mixture of love and something deeper, something more complex. Now, he understood. The following Monday, Thomas returned to work, his body still bruised but his mind sharper than ever. His confrontation with Seymour was inevitable, but this time he wasn't going to let his superior's games intimidate him. The truth about his father, his mother, and the world he had been shielded from had shifted something inside him. He was no longer the quiet, agreeable employee Seymour had manipulated. Seymour avoided him in the office, his cowardice now apparent to everyone. But Thomas wasn't content to leave things at that. He arranged a meeting with the company's CEO, Margaret Foster, a formidable woman known for her no-nonsense approach to leadership. When Thomas laid out the details of the harassment he had endured at Seymour's hands, along with the orchestrated attack at the bar, Margaret's face hardened. She was the type of executive who valued integrity above all else, and the revelation that one of her regional managers had engaged in such unethical behavior was met with swift action. By the end of the day, Seymour's office was cleared out, his tenure at Barnett Industries abruptly terminated. Thomas watched him leave with a sense of satisfaction, not because he enjoyed seeing a man's downfall, but because justice had been served. Seymour's reign of toxicity was over. But the end of Seymour wasn't the only change in Thomas's life. The encounter at the bar, the revelations about his family, had lit a fire inside him. He wasn't content to coast through life anymore. He wanted to make something more of himself, not just in his career but in his personal life as well. That evening he met Bobby at a small cafe far from the dimly lit bar where their lives had collided. They sat at a corner table, the hum of quiet conversation filling the space around them. "So, what now?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. Bobby sipped his coffee, looking out the window for a moment before turning back to his son. "That depends on you, Thomas. I don't expect you to want me around, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I'm here, and I'll stay here as long as you want me to." Thomas looked down at his hands, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. Forgiveness didn't come easily, and the scars of the past were still fresh. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the connection he felt to this man, his father. Despite everything, there was a part of him that wanted to rebuild something from the ashes of the past. "I don't know where this goes," Thomas admitted, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'm willing to try." Bobby nodded, a hint of relief flickering in his eyes. "That's all I can ask." Months passed, and slowly Thomas and Bobby began to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the weight of the past threatened to tear them apart again. But they kept at it, piece by piece, trying to forge something new. Thomas' career at Barnett Industries continued to thrive, and with Seymour gone, the atmosphere in the office lightened. He found himself taking on more leadership roles, mentoring younger employees, and feeling more confident in his abilities. The lessons he had learned from his family's complex history about loyalty, betrayal, and redemption made him a stronger person, both professionally and personally. And as for Bobby, he slowly distanced himself from the criminal life that had once consumed him. With Mita's support, he found new ways to channel his energy, working in the community and helping at-risk youth avoid the path he had once walked. In the end, Thomas learned that redemption wasn't a single act. It was a process, a journey of small steps and hard choices. His mother's legacy, the strength she had shown in leaving a life that no longer served her, guided him as he moved forward. So one evening, as the sun set over the city, Thomas stood at the edge of the river where his mother used to take him as a child. He thought of her, of the life she had tried to give him, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't alone anymore. He had his father, his work, and most of all, he had himself stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. The past, with all its secrets and pain, no longer had power over him. It was time to move forward into the future with hope. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow,